Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining our webinar, Navigating New Laws and Protocols Around Public Meetings. I'm Melissa Keene. I'm a Senior Program Manager with the Institute for Local Government and will be your host and moderator this afternoon. A quick overview of the agenda that we'll be working with today. So we just have some introductory remarks and logistics and introductions, and then we will hear 3 presentations from our attorney friends at Hanson Bridget, who will talk through some of the Brown Act requirements and changes to those meeting protocols. And then we're also joined by Donna Johnston, who's the clerk of the board with Sutter County, who will talk through some of their protocols and lessons learned and processes as it relates to some of these changes and transitions to virtual board meetings. Then we will also do some additional polling and have a panel discussion and Q&A, and they will wrap up and adjourn by 2 p.m. this afternoon. So you've probably noticed that your line has been muted, and due to the size of the audience today, your line will remain muted for the duration of today's webinar, but that doesn't mean that you can't chat with us or ask us questions. So on the right-hand part of your control panel on your screen, you should see a questions box. And you can type in questions to us at any point in time during the webinar. We will be monitoring that on the back end, responding to any logistical questions, and then getting your substantive questions into the queue for that Q&A towards the end of today's webinar. We are also recording the webinar, and we'll be distributing that recording along with the slide deck and some sample ordinances after the fact, likely later this week. So stay tuned for that as well. Just a little bit of information about ILG in case you're not super familiar with us. We are the nonprofit affiliate of the League of California Cities, the California State Association of Counties, and the California Special Districts Association. So we work together with our affiliates to serve cities, counties, and special districts statewide and provide practical and easy-to-use resources so that local agencies can effectively implement policies on the ground. We do this in a number of ways and on a number of subjects. So our main program areas focus on leadership and governance, which is your state mandated trainings and how to work together effectively as a board or council, and your relationship with staff and roles and responsibilities, and a number of things like that. We also work on civics education and workforce, which helps create the pipeline to public service and help facilitate municipal school partnerships. We have a program area focused on public engagement, which covers a whole host of things from getting started to dealing with difficult meeting participants to subject matter public engagement around some of the really complex issues that you all are tackling on the ground. And then we also have a sustainable and resilient communities program that right now is focusing a lot on housing and land use, but we also run programs to recognize voluntary efforts by cities, counties, and districts to implement sustainability best practices, recognize leadership in that area, recognize energy savings and greenhouse gas emission reductions and things of that nature. So how do we do this? We do this through a lot of trainings and webinars and conference sessions like the one you're on today. We also provide technical assistance for local governments statewide, capacity building, and convening services. So if you're not super familiar with us, definitely recommend that you go to our website, check out a lot of our free resources, and definitely don't hesitate to reach out if you have questions or need assistance in any way. So we're hoping to get a little bit of information from you all about who's on the line today. So we're going to do some instant polling up front here, and then some polling later on in the webinar to also get some additional feedback from you all. So this is another way that we hope that you'll engage with us during today's webinar. So if you can either take out your smartphone or open another window in your browser, on your tablet or laptop or desktop, whatever you're joining from today, and go to sift.ly, and then it'll ask you for that participant code, the 6TFN. So we'll give you all just a second to get connected to that. If you're having issues, you can type in a question and we'll hopefully be able to help you get connected. But I see a number of you are already joining and participating in our first question. So let me get that up on the screen for everybody so you guys can see the results. If you're still working to get connected, you can see that URL and meeting ID up on the top right-hand part of your screen. So if you're still connecting, feel free to continue to get on board and respond to this question. So just right now trying to get the lay of the land in terms of how many of you are with a city, how many are with a county, how many are with a special district, or who might be joining us either from a nonprofit or a consulting firm or others that work with local government. So give this just another second as you guys continue to get connected and respond. But for now, it looks like we've got almost half of the folks on the line are with a city. Oh, that's going down a little bit. Perfect. See this adjust as more folks respond. But again, looks like almost half are with the city, about a quarter with a county, a little over 12% with a special district, and then another 17% with other. So I'm going to keep us moving. If you're still trying to connect, don't worry, that code and URL will stay on the top part of the screen there. We just have a couple of other kind of startup questions for us. So we're also curious, what best describes your role with local government? Are you an elected official? Are you a clerk or board secretary? Other staff? Are you a consultant? Let this adjust here for a minute. Looks like most of you that are logged in have responded. So about half are local government staff, with about a third of that being a city clerk or clerk of the board or board secretary. About 5% elected officials on the line. About 4% of you all are consultants. And then another 13% or so have another connection to local government. Perfect, thank you. So a couple other quick questions to kick us off here. So this is a question we've been asking in a lot of our webinars and meetings, and so we're just curious how much participation your agency is seeing in this more virtual meeting environment. Are you seeing more than before, less than before, about the same, or are you not sure? Just a minute to adjust. Looks like most of you have responded, so a little bit over half of you have seen more participation than before in your standard in-person meetings, and then about equally split between less than before and about the same, and about 10% of you are not sure. This is pretty typical of what we've been seeing. A good chunk of folks are definitely seeing more participation than before, but it has also definitely illuminated some of the challenges that go along with virtual meetings around the digital divide and access to technology and broadband and things like that. So thank you for sharing. And then just one final question about how you all are holding your public meetings right now in 2022. Looks like most folks have responded, so a good chunk of you are still holding mainly virtual meetings. That's not surprising. It seems like something changes every week, right? And have to figure out how to navigate that. A little over 10% are mainly in person. Almost a quarter of folks are working through a hybrid model, and then a few of you are still figuring it out, which I thought might be the case. We're still early in the year, and again, things are changing very quickly. So trying to figure out what that looks like for this year makes sense. So perfect. Thank you so much for sharing. We will have a few more questions towards the end of the webinar when we go into the panel discussion to get some more feedback on what challenges you're facing and how you're really working to navigate some of these new regulations and new laws. So appreciate your participation, and go ahead and keep that device out, and we will come back to that a little bit later. So to jump back in, just want to quickly introduce our speakers for this afternoon. So we are joined by Julian Vixman and Brendan Adams from Hanson Bridget. who will kick us off with an overview of some of the Brown Act considerations and the transitions into the new AB 361 requirements. And then we are also joined by Donna Johnston, who's the clerk recorder and clerk of the board for Sutter County, who will talk about some of this in very practical terms in terms of what this has looked like in her county and how they're really working through that. So I'm going to go ahead and kick this over to Julian to start us off. So thank you very much, Julian.
Thanks, Melissa, and thank you everyone for participating in the polling. So my name is Julian Bixman. I'm an attorney at Hanson Bridget. My practice generally is advice and counsel for our public agency clients. Along with Brendan, I've been monitoring AB 361 from when it was introduced in the legislature, and together we have been advising our clients on compliance with AB 361 and the Brown Act. Brendan, you're muted. Oh, you're still muted.
There we go. That should do it. Thanks, Julian. My name is Brendan Adams, and like Julian, I am an associate at Hanson Bridget, representing our public agency clients. I have a background in public transportation, and I'm based out of our San Francisco office, although I worked for a few years with LA County in Southern California. So we will be talking today. Next slide, please. So today we're going to be trying to answer two overall questions for you. What is the Brown Act, and how did AB 361 passed last year change the Brown Act? So we'll start with an overview, topic one. We'll move on to AB 361. Then at that point, we will discuss some practical considerations, some implementation of AB 361. And then after that, we will move on to a Q&A, as we discussed earlier, with Donna from Sutter County. And if she's available to join us, Dora Siemens, who is the district secretary for the San Mateo County Transit District. Although Dora is, like many of you I'm sure know, up against some meeting deadlines here this week. So we'll see if she's able to make it. Next slide. Okay, so we'll start with the Brown Act. And when we discuss anything with the Brown Act, we can kind of boil it down to one overall purpose, and that is to provide public access to meetings of California local government agencies. So when the legislature passed the Brown Act, the goal was to promote transparency and allow the public to participate in public meetings to the greatest extent possible. And I don't think that we have too many folks on here today from state agencies, but when we are talking about state agencies, you can basically just take everything that we say, swap out the Brown Act for the Bagley-Keene Act, which was passed a few years later, and does essentially the same things for state boards and commissions. So the requirements there under Bagley-Keene are very similar to the Brown Act. Next slide. And the Brown Act, it all comes down really to one section, what you see on the screen here. All meetings, the legislative body, the local agency shall be open and public, and all persons shall be permitted to attend. Those bold words are really keys to the statute. They've been in the law since it was passed, and they haven't been changed. So this really is everything about the Brown Act in one sentence. And as we go through, you'll see that the definitions of some of these terms are really what are the key in terms of implementing Brown Act requirements. So what is a meeting, what is a legislative body, and what is a local agency are really where it gets into the nitty-gritty of how the Brown Act will impact you. Next slide. So the first word that really, in that sentence on the prior slide, the first word that really impacts us is the word meetings. The Brown Act is all about meetings. So what is a meeting? A meeting is any time a majority of your board or your legislative body gathers to discuss matters within its authority. So we might think of a meeting as being sitting around a table at a boardroom with microphones. But in reality, a meeting can happen in any number of ways. It's anytime those members, a majority of them gather and discuss official business, is going to be considered a meeting under the Brown Act. A little bit later on, we'll touch on how that can impact you. Now, anytime that happens, anytime there's a meeting, there are three things that you need to make sure happen to comply with the Brown Act. There needs to be notice to the public that that meeting is happening. There needs to be an agenda, which explains what is happening at the meeting. And then finally, there has to be a chance for the public to comment. So all of these three things must work together. You know, if you provide notice of a meeting, but you don't tell anybody what you're going to be discussing, you haven't really given the public a chance to participate. Likewise, if you have an agenda for the meeting, but you don't tell anybody that it's happening, you also have not provided the public with a chance to participate. And if you don't do these things, what happens? Well, the most immediate consequence is that the whole meeting can be invalidated. You can have to go back and take all those actions that you took at the meeting and do it over again. There's actually even a provision that allows somebody who has knowingly violated the Brown Act to be charged with a misdemeanor. Finally, on the bottom there, you'll see in blue 2 laws that are relatively new that have sort of supplemented the requirements of under the Brown Act, AB 2257, requiring agendas or links to agendas to be posted on primary websites, which hopefully everybody here is doing. And then underneath that, AB 1787 allows members of the public who are using translators to receive twice the amount of time for their public comment. Next slide. You know, actually, I see a good question here in the chat box about where those agendas need to be posted. So we're going to be touching on that in just a second. So I'll quickly move through this. Closed session. So closed session is something that most of us have seen in meetings. And you'll see here that we've titled this closed session exception. And that's because the Brown Act treats everything under closed session as an exception to the rule that the public needs to be participating. So whenever we're thinking about closed session, overall, we need to remember that these are limited. There's only specific times when the Brown Act says that you can meet in closed session. You see those listed here on the slide. For real property negotiations, very limited. It needs to be the price in terms of payment only. Pending litigation, and personnel. Again, personnel is an area where there have been changes in the law recently. So you're not permitted to approve compensation in a closed session meeting. Those need to be open to the public when you're approving payment for personnel. And then similarly under SB 1436, if there's a recommendation impacting compensation, it needs to be orally reported outside of closed session. Finally, threats to public safety and labor negotiations. So these are all need to be construed in a limited fashion because they are exceptions to the rule of transparency. And a good reminder is that anything that is happening in closed session, it needs to be happening in closed session for a reason. So if it's in closed session, there needs to be the duty of confidentiality to keep those matters private. Next slide. Okay, so pitfalls under the Brown Act. And really, we're going to focus on one glaring pitfall here that I alluded to earlier, and that's that a meeting can crop up even when you didn't expect a meeting to come up. We have a couple exceptions, but like I mentioned earlier, if a majority of the board or your legislative body is together discussing official business, regardless of the setting, the Brown Act defines that as a meeting and Brown Act requirements will apply. So there are specific exceptions. For instance, if the members are at a conference together and the conference is scheduled, they are permitted to talk about official business at something like a conference. You see here on the second bullet point for serial conversations, these are common ways that a meeting can happen in a way that you might not expect for it to be a meeting. And so we have 2 terms to describe these scenarios: a daisy chain or a hub and spoke. What a daisy chain meeting or conversation is when one member takes an individual conversation, which would not ordinarily be a meeting under the Brown Act, but has repeated one-on-one conversations, so that we essentially start to be playing a game of telephone, where one member speaks to another member, explaining what their vote might be or their position on a topic, explains to another member, and eventually we've worked our way around and formed consensus without ever having a meeting. That would be a daisy chain meeting. Hub and spoke is a similar idea where one person repeatedly reaches out to several other members and is able to coordinate everybody around them, and basically leads to a meeting without ever having brought everyone together at the same time. Again, all of those would qualify as a meeting under the Brown Act, and if they weren't on an agenda and noticed properly, that's going to be run the risk of being invalidated or other consequences under the Brown Act. And again, email internet just adds complications to this. Technology just increases the opportunities for these meetings to happen inadvertently. Next slide. So before we move into the new Brown Act teleconferencing, we wanted to emphasize that teleconferencing has always been a part of the Brown Act. The idea that members can participate remotely is not new. It was in place well before the pandemic, and I'm sure many of you have had experience with it. So the definition of teleconference, as I mentioned, has been in the Brown Act and was not actually changed by AB 361. It's a meeting where the legislative body, the members of which are in different locations, are connected through electronic means. And that remains the same today. Next slide. So what has changed are these traditional Brown Act teleconferencing rules. Those of you who have run Brown Act teleconferences prior to AB 361 might be familiar with some of these requirements. A lot of people consider them to be somewhat onerous, and they really didn't mesh well with the social distancing circumstances we've had on and off for the last 2 years. So for example, well, here are the requirements on the screen in front of you. We're required to post agendas at all teleconference locations, regardless of where somebody is participating from. An agenda needed to be posted outside. Those teleconference locations needed to be publicly noticed. The specific location where a member was going to be participating from needed to be available to the public, so the public could address their representatives in person if they so desired. So similarly, under number 3, the teleconference locations needed to be accessible. And then finally, a quorum of the legislative body needed to be within the boundaries of the local agency's jurisdiction. You can kind of see how during a shelter in place or a social distancing scenario or any other sort of emergency, these requirements aren't necessarily conducive to holding a meeting, say, in your own kitchen for your city council members. So that's what gives rise to AB 361. And with that, I will turn it over to Julian to talk about those changes.
Thanks, Brendan. So now we're going to look at AB 361 and how it affected the Brown Act. Next slide, please. So what is AB 361? Well, AB 361 is an urgency legislation that was signed into law by Governor Newsom in September 21. It was a direct response to the COVID-19 pandemic and was intended to improve public access to state and local agency meetings during the COVID-19 pandemic and future applicable emergencies. AB 361 accomplished this by allowing broader access to public meetings through teleconferencing options. AB 361 suspends the Brown Act's teleconferencing requirements, provided that certain notice and accessibility requirements are met. As Brendan said, I should note that the regular Brown Act teleconferencing rules are still in effect and can be used. AB 361 just provides an alternative teleconferencing option in certain situations. Besides for the Brown Act, AB 361 also amends the Bagley-Keene Open Meetings Act and some existing laws related to California state universities. The provisions of AB 361 amending the Bagley-Keene Act and for Cal States, those will no longer be operative as of January 31st, 2022. But the provisions amending the Brown Act will remain in effect until January 1st, 2024. After that date, those provisions will be repealed, and if you want to teleconference, you have to follow the traditional teleconferencing rules. Next slide, please, Melissa. So AB 361 allows legislative bodies to meet remotely without making the teleconference location accessible to the public and without a quorum of the legislative body participating from the boundaries within the jurisdiction in 3 circumstances, which we'll dive a little deeper into them shortly. The first circumstance is the legislative body holds a meeting during a proclaimed state of emergency and state or local officials have imposed or recommended measures to promote social distancing. The second is if the legislative body holds a meeting during a proclaimed state of emergency for the purpose of determining by majority vote whether as a result of the emergency, meeting in person would present imminent risk to the health and safety of attendees. And then the third is the legislative body holds a meeting during a proclaimed state of emergency and that's determined by majority vote that as a result of the emergency, meeting in person would present imminent risk to the health and safety of the attendees. So let's look a little, in these 3 circumstances, the agency can meet remotely without making the teleconference location accessible to the public and without a quorum of the legislative body participating within the boundaries of the jurisdiction. Well, let's dive a little bit deeper into them. You can see that the foundational, I'm sorry, can you go back a slide? Thank you. You can see that the foundational element for relying on AB 361 is a proclaimed state of emergency. It is the only thing common among all of the circumstances. So the state of emergency referred to in the statute is one that must be proclaimed by the governor. It does not refer to local emergencies. If you look at the first bullet point also, you will see it refers to state or local officials. So by its plain terms, this excludes recommendations by federal agencies such as the CDC. This means that cities, counties, and other agencies cannot rely on CDC recommendations alone. But I'll say that a lot of times the local orders refer to the CDC recommendations. So in that case, you'll be relying on the local orders, which, they refer to the CDC recommendations. One more thing to note on the first bullet point. You'll see the language says imposed or recommended measures to promote social distancing. So if you're looking to use AB 361 and rely on this language to do so, you don't have to have an official health order imposing social distancing. It could be a more indirect recommendation. For the second and third bullet points, you could see that it dispenses with the state or local official language and the social distancing language. Instead, these circumstances are appropriate when, as a result of the emergency, meeting in person would present imminent risk to the health and safety of attendees. Both circumstances require a majority vote. The only difference between them is in the second bullet point, you're meeting for the purpose of determining whether there's an imminent risk to the health and safety of attendees. And in the third bullet, that has already been determined. But these are 3 disjunctive conditions. So meeting any one of these will allow the agency to use AB 361. The last thing I want to say on this is that many agencies have taken the position that the governing board can make these findings for itself and its committees. We think that's consistent with the text and the intent of the statute, but a more conservative approach that some agencies take on is for the committees to make the findings themselves. Next slide, please. AB 361 adds additional requirements to the traditional Brown Act notice and agenda requirements. Under AB 361, you must provide notice of the means by which members of the public may access the meeting and offer public comment. This means the notice should include items like meeting links, access codes, dial-in numbers, any information needed to access the platform, and that will just depend on the platform you choose. The agenda must also identify and include an opportunity for all persons to attend via a call-in option or an internet-based service option. Now, existing law already prohibits members of the public from being required to provide certain information, such as entering his or her name as a condition to attend a meeting. This can lead to complications with the AB 361 regime when agencies are using platforms that require certain information or registration. AB 361 addresses this issue by permitting agencies to use a third party's internet website or online platform that requires registration to log into the teleconference. So platforms like Zoom and other things that require some kind of registration, they are allowed to be used. And then again, note that under AB 361, you don't need to post agendas at the teleconference locations or keep them open to the public or have a quorum of the members of the legislative body participate from the agency. Next slide, please. AB 361 also includes specific provisions related to public comment. It adds a requirement that if something happens that prevents the agency from broadcasting the meeting to the public using the call-in option or internet service option, then the legislative body cannot take further action on items until public access to the meeting is restored. If the agency takes action on agenda items during that disruption, then they could be challenged under the Brown Act. And I think Brendan went over that earlier for invalidated actions and other penalties. The agency also cannot require the public to submit their comments in advance of the meeting and must provide the public an opportunity to address the legislative body and offer comment in real time. Lastly, AB 361 contains certain requirements on keeping public comment open until either the allotted time period is up or a reasonable amount of time has elapsed. It's important to remember to allow the public time to register and get familiar with the platform. Next slide, please. So to continue teleconferencing under AB 361, the legislative body must make certain findings every 30 days. Usually this is done by another resolution, and I guess it could be done by an ordinance, but usually resolution. AB 361 says that if a state of emergency remains active or state or local officials have imposed recommended measures to promote social distancing, then the legislative body must make the following findings by majority vote every 30 days after teleconferencing for the first time. First, that the legislative body has reconsidered the circumstances of the state of emergency. And then second, that either the state of emergency continues to impact the ability of the members to meet safely in public, or state or local officials have continued to impose or recommend measures to promote social distancing. So you can see that, so the prerequisites are that the state of emergency remains active or state or local officials have imposed or recommended measures to promote social distancing. And then the findings that the legislative body has to make are that it reconsidered the circumstances of the state of emergency, and either one of those last 2 points are met, that the state of emergency continues to impact the ability of the members to meet safely in person, or state or local officials continue to impose or recommend social distancing measures. Now, this presents an issue for agencies that meet irregularly. So if an agency meets every other month, then it's outside that 30-day time period for making the findings. A conservative approach would be to hold a special meeting within 30 days to adopt those findings, but most agencies that we talk to instead pass an initial AB 361 resolution at the beginning of the next meeting. So, for example, we were speaking with one JPA who has many members from all different kinds of jurisdictions, and they said that it was too impractical to get all of the members of the JPA together for a special meeting just to make these findings. So instead, they pass an AB 361 resolution at the beginning of each meeting on the consent calendar. Next slide, please. So in this slide, we recap and compare some of the key differences between teleconferencing under the traditional Brown Act rules and teleconferencing under AB 361. So this is just kind of a recap, but you can see that under the traditional teleconferencing rules, the agenda must be posted at every teleconference location, which would be accessible to the public. Under AB 361, the agenda does not need to be posted at every teleconference location, and those locations are not made available to the public. Regarding notice, the agency must, under AB 361, the agency must provide notice of the means by which the public can access the meeting and offer public comment. This is not a specific requirement in the traditional teleconferencing rules. Under the traditional Brown Act rules, a quorum of the board has to participate within the boundaries of the agency. AB 361 dispenses with this requirement. AB 361 has these initial resolutions and ongoing findings. Those are not required by the traditional Brown Act teleconferencing rules. And then don't forget this disruption event where under AB 361, if for some reason there's an event that disrupts the agency from broadcasting the meeting, the agency has to halt the meeting and take no further action on agenda items until the access is restored. The normal Brown Act doesn't contain such requirements. Next, please. So next, we're going to look at some practical implications an agency should consider when determining whether to rely on AB 361. We'll look at some technological and capacity constraints, hybrid meetings, and some ethical implications of AB 361. Next slide, please. So technology. One thing to consider is whether the agency has adequate technology to broadcast the meeting and receive public comment. Under AB 361, simply broadcasting the meeting is not enough. Your video conference must allow the public to participate. Another thing to consider is the agency's response to disruption events. We just talked about it. Under AB 361, you cannot take official action if your broadcast fails. So if your software setup is not reliable, it could seriously undermine your board meetings. This also raises some risk issues. Is it worth the risk of having to stop your board meeting if something disrupts the broadcast? For example, one of our clients was considering whether to hold an AB 361 meeting. It was an important board meeting. They ultimately decided not to do so because they felt that their technology was unreliable and the broadcast would fail, thus halting all action on the agenda items until the meeting was restored. The agency actually broadcast it for convenience, and the broadcast did fail. So I think it was a very good decision not to follow AB 361 until they could iron out all of those technological issues. Moderating the chat and using mute functions. So AB 361 does not change anything about moderating public comment. The video conference mute functions can be used in the same way you would use the microphone at an in-person meeting. Next slide, please. Capacity. Your agency should consider if there's enough capacity for the board and the public to meet in person. If there are social distancing orders in your jurisdiction, is there enough space for everyone to socially distance at the meeting? Maybe you need an overflow room for the public to use. Does your agency have capacity for that? There is no one size fits all for this. Every agency has to consider the amount of attendees it generally receives in local and state health orders and recommendations. If your board feels that the nature of your meeting space prevents it from holding safe meetings, then they could always use AB 361. That is what the procedures are there for. Next slide, please. So hybrid meetings. We are seeing many agencies are deciding to broadcast their meeting to the public for convenience, but still hold board meetings in person for the public to attend and offer comment. Now, these aren't really hybrid meetings. Rather, they're traditional Brown Act in-person meetings that are only being broadcast for convenience. But we do find that they are generally very helpful for attendance. Partial attendance by the board. So staff and some of the board can meet in person and still comply with AB 361, but all of the board cannot meet in person and call it a teleconference. This goes back to the Brown Act definition that Brendan said earlier, where the Brown Act defines a teleconference as a meeting of the legislative body, the members of which are in different locations connected by electronic means. So a plain and conservative reading indicates that all of the board members cannot participate from one location like a boardroom while the public is excluded. Lastly, when choosing the type of meeting, it's always important to remember the safety-oriented provisions of AB 361, and this can lead us to the ethical implications. Next slide, please. So it's important to remember that AB 361 was intended to improve public access to meetings during the COVID-19 pandemic and other future applicable emergencies. It contemplates the health and safety of the public attendees and the agency. And by that, I mean the staff and the board. This means that AB 361 should not be used for convenience, like holding an AB 361 teleconference meeting, because some members of the board prefer to attend meetings from home and drink wine in their pajamas and things like that. That's not what AB 361 was intended to do. If an agency is switching between AB 361 and teleconference meetings and other Brown Act meetings, it should have some justification grounded in health and safety concerns for doing so. Remember, the whole purpose of the Brown Act is to provide greater public access to meetings and promote transparency and public participation. And by our polling questions in the beginning, it looks like it's doing just that. Okay, next slide, please.
Thank you so much, Julian and Brendan. Really quickly, before we turn it over to Donna to talk through her experience in Sutter County, we are getting quite a few questions, and I'm wondering if you can clarify the 30-day clause in this, in terms of having to pass that resolution every 30 days, or what the other options are, in case your border commission doesn't meet every 30 days, or there's a lapse in that approval, or something like that. Can you clarify? I know you spoke to it a little bit, but could you clarify a little bit more about that process and what options might be available to our local governments on the line? Absolutely.
So it depends on how infrequently your board is meeting. What we're finding is that if your board meets on March 2nd, and then the next time it's April 5th, just by the drop of the calendar, it happens to be a little over 30 days. A lot of agencies we're seeing are just considering that within the 30-day mark. If it's just 1 or 2 days, they think that they're still satisfying the intent and the spirit of the law, so they could just continue as if it was within 30 days. If they meet more irregularly, like we're talking about every other month, something like that, then the conservative approach would be to hold a special meeting within that 30 days to adopt the findings. But practically that's not feasible in a lot of situations. So like I gave an example of a JPA that has 24 members from different cities, from different jurisdictions, cities and other agencies. It would be too impractical for all of them to they already have trouble getting all together for a meeting every other month. It would be very impractical for them to get together for a special meeting every 30 days to make these findings. So instead, what they do is whenever that next meeting occurs, they'll adopt that initial, it will be like a new AB 361 meeting. They're not really doing these ongoing findings, but rather they're re-adopting that initial AB 361 resolution that they did, and they're starting it over. And you could say there's a lot of different ways to phrase it in the resolution. I suggest talking to your legal counsel for that, but we think that is totally acceptable as well.
Yeah, I would just add one thing Julian mentioned earlier, which is, again, there's going to be that risk calculation of what is going on at this meeting. I think we all know that not every meeting is created equally, so that's probably another factor you'll want to consider.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that clarification. And sounds like, if in doubt, definitely connect with your city attorney or your county council or district council or things like that to get clarification on your particular circumstances. Perfect. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Donna Johnston with Sutter County to talk through some of her experiences trying to navigate all of this on the ground. So Donna?
All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to talk to you a bit about Sutter County and what we went through during this whole story. So to give you a little bit of background, Sutter County borders Sacramento County to the north. We're considered a smaller side of a medium-sized county. We've got 5 board members sitting on the board of supervisors, and until the pandemic, everything was in person. If a board member couldn't make a meeting, they simply were not there. Therefore, votes were reflective of who was present and so forth. Then, like all of you, our whole world turned upside down, along with trying to figure out if we can even come out of our homes, facing all kinds of personal challenges and so forth. We had to ensure that the county's business could continue, as well as having safe and secure access for the public to be a participating entity in this process. So we started assessing our lack of technology. We had participated in Zoom meetings for other things before, but just basically as participants. in our county, certainly not for a board meeting or anything that of any kind of nature where we were hosting a meeting. Thankfully, we did have some webcams. We quickly ordered more, thank goodness for Amazon, to distribute to departments. We even bought a little owl camera, which would go into our chambers area to take a look in the audience and kind of spin around and do some fancy things to in the process of getting ready for a board meeting. Our board chair, who was in his 70s at the time, wanted nothing to do with technology and wanted to continue live meetings. He was especially concerned with having to try to moderate a meeting remotely. So we initially landed on a hybrid. The chair would be at the board chambers along with the county administrative office, county council, and board clerks. County was already using Microsoft Teams for a few small meetings, so we felt comfortable with that technology, and we set it up so that department heads and anyone else who was presenting an item could either dial in or connect via the computer with a webcam so that we could see them ideally. We had a system set up where we would be in there using a live stream, so we do live stream our meetings, and we did not have a process in place, however, to do anything with public comment. We still had the, like I said, the live feed available so public could view the meeting, but they couldn't participate in the meeting. So our board chambers were initially closed to the public. The few of us remaining were physically separated for these first few meetings. And then a month later, when we got our plexiglass, they started separating us with plexiglass. I make a joke that we're in a phone booth. The board clerks are kind of sort of in a phone booth setup with plexiglass all around us. Everyone had masks of some sort on in those early days, different varieties. It was an extremely strange feeling, as I'm sure most of you have experienced, conducting those meetings with only, with our case, one board member present. The chair was the only one who would come in and no one else but staff in the room. Public comment was done via email. Anyone wishing to address the board members would need to send an email until about 1 o'clock on the meeting day, and our meeting started at 3. We read it into the record, as well as sending a copy of it to each one of the board members. Board members had to be trained on how to electronically participate. I think all of us that have been clerking these meetings can share those horror stories of board members trying to participate in the early days. We were searching for a better way, however, to conduct public comment, as we heard from the public that we were not reading the letters with the same expression that they would if they could participate themselves. We even had one person very upset with one of the clerks mispronouncing something incorrectly. Some were sending in comments during the meeting, which was after our cutoff time. We tried our best with our cell phones because we already had 2 systems going, the Microsoft Teams system going, and then also the live stream going, and keeping minutes. We went from 1 board clerk to 2 and then to 3 at some point. We would try to catch as many public comments as we could during the meeting to help facilitate that process, but inevitably missed some. At times, it was personally very difficult for us to read some of the comments that were in the letters from public comment because they were not especially kind remarks and they were focused at the board members directly. And we internally in the county did make a decision to edit out expletives by saying the word bleep. We just didn't feel that that was appropriate to bring forward. We appreciated the feedback we were getting from the public. However, our county was seeing what was happening all across the nation. Board and council meetings being hijacked by the public in various different ways. And at the time, most of it was happening over the Zoom platform. We continued to search for a better way to facilitate public engagement by looking into other platforms while maintaining our live stream meetings as well. So this went on for the most of spring, summer of 2020, until we secured more PPE and installed more plexiglass in the chambers area. Eventually, we allowed department heads back in if they wanted to attend. Anyone presenting at the meeting was welcome to attend if they felt comfortable to do so. The full board was present. Public comment was still facilitated via email at this point. In the fall of 2020, we decided to try to open to the public with some social distancing measures in place. So we taped off our seats and left about 20 spots from the public. We normally had about 75. We encouraged departments who were presenting now to do it electronically to minimize the number of seats that were being available to the public. We want to make sure the public could get in there as best as possible. Our first meeting was fairly quiet and orderly. But from then on, things were not so easy. One group in particular started coming to meetings with the purpose of trying to stop proceedings. They removed the tape for seating, yelled at board members, refused to wear masks, took longer than 3 minutes for each time they were giving public comment. They even actively at one point asked the sheriff officers to arrest them while the others had their cameras going on their phones. Eventually, we just had to take some other action. At that point, we did pause meetings and ask that the public, the people that were doing this, either adhere to the rules that we had in place or to please leave. Things eventually improved though as we decided to engage outside of the meetings with these particular groups in order to keep the meetings open. We just basically went to them, had a discussion and said, look, we are trying our best to open this back up to the public, but we need your help. We need you to adhere to the rules we have in place, and that seemed to work fairly well. It's not in all cases, you don't get everyone when you're trying these things, but it did help with that behavior just to some extent. Then all 5 of the board members were exposed and quarantined 2 days before a board meeting. So that the decision was made by the board chair to have the meeting anyway and make it virtual. And oh, by the way, let's do it on Zoom instead of Teams and what we've been doing before, and let the public comment and let me know 24 hours before the meeting. So we had to scramble. We had to purchase the Zoom software, created a link, amended the agenda, distributed the agenda, took a crash course on running Zoom. We had 5 IT staff, 3 board clerk staff, 1 recorder who was a board clerk previously at another county who had done at least a Zoom meeting before, and had 2 additional laptops as a backup in case we had any issues. And then we launched our meeting. We were very happy to only have a few people wanted to give public comment. We just put that into the chat feature. Then they let us know that they wanted to speak. We called them off in order. The time was, they adhered to their time. It went very well. However, the wall-mounted computer we were using in the area that all of us were in froze up when we were scrolling through a presentation. And then it went down, and then we had to spring laptop number 1 into action. Laptop number 1 was up and running our agenda software as well. That was a little too much for it to handle, so then it went down. So laptop 2 had to facilitate the rest of the meeting. Thank goodness for backup plans is all I have to say. The board chair complimented us afterwards and thankfully had no idea of the level of stress we were under because they couldn't see anything. It was seamless on their end. So to us, that was a huge success. As executive orders were implemented and laws have changed, we just adapted. We just rolled with it. We're now fully open to the public. We continue to utilize Teams platform for anyone who prefers to present remotely. We do have AB 361 resolution in place, as well as all of our other boards and commissions within the county. They did theirs all separately. It's on our agenda every 30 days to allow us to pivot it if necessary. And the board's exposure was a lesson learned early on that we hope will never happen again, but if it should, we'll be ready to go. And so that is Sutter County's story on what happened during all of this process.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Donna. And I don't think it's ever a bad idea to have a plan B. That's something we always talk about when we're talking about any type of public meeting. And so learning from your experience there, definitely good to have a plan B and maybe a plan C in place too. Before we jump into back into the polling and some of the broader panel discussions, I am seeing a couple of things that folks are looking for clarification on. So I'm wondering if we can just quickly jump back to a couple of those things and then we can go back into the discussion. So Julian and Brendan, there's a couple of questions around what constitutes a hybrid meeting and how that all works. So if there's an instance in which the whole council or board is going to be present on site for that council or board meeting, the public meeting, but they're allowing the public to participate virtually, is that considered a quote hybrid meeting? Is that acceptable under AB 361? Can you guys speak a little bit to that scenario?
Yes, I could start, and Brendan, you could jump in. Well, the Brown Act defines a teleconference meeting as one where the members participate. Well, let me find the full definition. So a teleconference is defined as a meeting of the legislative body, the members of which are in different locations connected by electronic means. So if you have the entire city council in one room, those members are not in different locations. They're in the same boardroom. So technically that doesn't satisfy the Brown Act's teleconference requirements. Practically or politically, you could see how it could be tenuous to have all of the board members meeting in person. You're saying it's safe enough for them to meet in person, but public is not allowed in there. And we've seen from like Donna's experiences that sometimes there's problems with this virtual participation. So if you think it's safe enough for all of the board to meet together, there are some political considerations also indicating that it's probably not a good idea for you to exclude the public as well. And it just doesn't meet the teleconference definition under the Brown Act.
Brendan, anything to add on that front?
Yeah, I would say that we definitely understand people's interest in that scenario. Our clients have also been asking about whether that is the next step they can take under AB 361. And we have taken a more conservative approach on that question, just in the spirit of transparency and recognizing that, as Julian said, it's not really a teleconference if everybody is there. And if it's not a teleconference, then there's really no legal grounds to bar the public from entering. So, we would recommend consulting with your legal counsel on that question, definitely. But it's one where we have taken a pretty conservative approach with our clients.
Perfect, thank you. And one other thing folks are looking for clarification on goes back to the agenda posting for teleconferencing meetings. So if the meeting is going to be remote, can you speak to the requirements of the agenda posting? So they're asking about do the connection details have to be posted and things like that. So can you just speak a little bit to some of the agenda posting requirements with this new process?
Yeah, the agenda has to identify and include an opportunity for all persons to attend through the call-in option or internet-based service option. So and so does the notice. So in the notice, we'll put the meeting links and the access codes and everything like that. And I think it's also a good idea to include all those in the agenda as well. Brendan, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I would. The only thing I would add, I saw one question about posting on the website. So the normal requirements apply. If you have a website, you need to post the agenda on the website. AB 361 doesn't change that.
Okay, so we are getting a lot of questions, and we'll get back to the audience questions in just a bit, but we are going to pop back into a little bit of polling and discussion around some of these requirements. So if you guys can get your smartphones or devices back out or reconnect. Got a few more questions here. And again, that code and the URL will stay on the screen, but let me get back into this. We're going to do this in kind of a free-flowing discussion. We're going to ask you some questions and then have the panelists respond to those same questions as we go through this. So moving into going back to the traditional teleconferencing meeting. So just curious how many of the folks on the line have participated or held traditional Brown Act teleconferencing meetings before. Give you guys just a second to respond here. It looks like a lot of you have. It looks like a little bit over half of you have held those traditional teleconferencing meetings before, and then a pretty even split between have not held and are not sure. Still folks are reconnecting, so I'll give this just another second, see if this adjusts anymore, but it looks like it's staying pretty close. Perfect. So we're also curious, what types of challenges did you face when you were holding those traditional teleconferencing meetings? Did you not have any challenges? Were you having challenges getting the public to participate? Tech issues? If there's another, if you want to drop what your other issue was into the questions box, we can take a look at that as well. A lot of technology issues, that's not surprising. But while we're seeing this adjust, would also just love to invite the panelists to share any challenges they've heard or come across in the general Brown Act teleconferencing space. Donna, maybe start with you. Have you had any challenges in your tenure as clerk?
Yeah, as far as holding regular teleconferencing meetings, yes.
Yeah.
We have a perception from our board members that they can hold it in the hotel room that they're staying in their room if they're teleconferencing in. So we've made that clear that the best practice for them is if there's a local public entity, a local fire station or something like that that they can go to, post the agenda outside of there, that they're fully, truly meeting that requirement. We prefer that over a meeting in a hotel lobby. So we just feel that that's a better perception for the public, to actually make sure that the public is truly aware and can feel comfortable attending in whatever that location is as well.
Yeah, having a public space for them to attend and participate, that's a good tip. Julian or Brendan, any other challenges you all have come across from your clients that you want to share, or any ways to address those?
I think overall, I would echo what Donna mentioned, and that's that most of the challenges come from the members themselves. We'd be more than happy to facilitate the traditional Brown Act teleconference, but often those requirements about being publicly accessible are the most challenging for the members themselves.
Perfect. All right. So next up, we're curious what platform you all are using. Zoom, Teams, WebEx, GoToMeeting. If there's another one that we don't know about, we're actually very curious. So if you wouldn't mind sharing what other platforms you're using in the questions, that'd be great. And then the NA is just in case you guys are not holding virtual meetings, everything's in person. Perfect. So also not surprising that vast majority, it looks like, are on Zoom. Nikita, anything that you can share that's coming in from the other
it seems
category
like
that folks are typing in?
Yeah, some folks are using Blue Jeans and something called Life Size, which I've never heard of.
Perfect. I always love hearing about new technology that's out there. So great. Looks like most of you have participated. So again, about 80% using Zoom, almost 8% on Teams, about 3% each for WebEx and GoToMeeting. And then it looks like a very small percentage of folks are not doing public meetings. All right, sorry. Sure, you're doing public meetings. You're not holding them virtually. Okay. So up next, we're curious, how many of you have already done 361 meetings?
While that's coming in, I see an interesting question here about breakout rooms and or a polling function like this one. I don't know how breakout rooms would work or what you'd be using them for. The polling right now, I wouldn't see that being an issue. Breakout rooms, if we were to apply the transparency principles we were talking about earlier, if certain members are saying things on the record in certain breakout rooms and not everyone is able to hear that, I would be a little bit wary. I would be definitely want to consult my counsel before we were limiting which representatives people could see and interact with.
And what we've done with that on our, instead of doing a breakout room, like I'm thinking of closed session. So if we were doing a closed session, we would do it before we would send out a separate link. So there was no possibility that anybody could join that meeting early or anything else like that. And then we would just make sure that when we were doing it early on, if all the board members were present, and this was before AB 361 and so forth, that no one was coming into that space because we had to socially distance them, which meant they couldn't go into where they normally go when they go into closed session because the room was too small.
Perfect. No, that's great tips. Thank you. Our next one is an open-ended question. So we're just curious if you can share anything about your experience with the AB 361 meeting. These can be challenges that you faced or things that have gone really positively. And while we're getting some of those in, would also love to hear from our panelists on this question. Donna, do you want to kick us off again? I know you spoke a little bit to this in your presentation, but any experience you want to share of what's going well or could be better?
What's going well is our transition from when we did it from Teams to the Zoom platform. More people were familiar with Zoom, and it was just an easier transition for them to get in and queue up for public comment, those types of things. We're getting a lot of people that would like to see that going forward as a permanent option, because our meetings are during the day, as a lot of board meetings are, and they feel it would allow for more public participation if we were to make that a permanent feature, instead of making them come to the board meeting, is what we're hearing, to actually express their opinion when now they're back open again.
Perfect. Seeing a lot of themes coming through in these comments from the audience. Some technology issues. It sounds like a lot of folks are saying it's going well, but that sometimes the meetings are running longer, so therefore it takes a lot more staff time. Definitely some concerns about IT issues and hackers and folks getting into the meetings and disrupting things. And we can share this after the fact too, if you guys are curious. This is all anonymous polling, so we won't be attributing these to you, but we can definitely share some of these thoughts with folks on the line after. So a lot of themes here, but it sounds like generally things are going well. Definitely seeing folks say that there's more participation, more attendance from their communities. A lot of folks have Zoom comments. Wow, great. We really appreciate these thoughts. No hacker issues on BlueJeans. Good to know. Yeah, Julie and Brendan, any thoughts on this? What have you guys heard, or what have you experienced?
I just saw a comment that I had also seen in the question box about sporadic internet, spotty internet in rural areas. And unfortunately, I don't have a clear answer for you. There's no standard in AB 361 about what is an interruption. But I would just take it back to that initial, the driving force behind the Brown Act has the internet degraded so much that the people watching the meeting don't know what's going on? That's the point where I would say that you really should consider stopping any official action. So hopefully it's somewhat helpful, but I would just encourage you to, first of all, consult with your counsel, but then also think about whether the public is still informed. If it's gotten so bad that they're not knowing what's going on, that's when I think you're going to want to maybe stop that AB 361 meeting.
Perfect. Yeah, I saw that question as well, so thank you for addressing that. See some comments here about closed session. Seems like these folks are doing things similar to Donna, what you mentioned in terms of having it be a separate meeting where only certain folks are able to get into. Definitely less travel, which is great. The ADA access issue, I've heard that come up both from I'm assuming this is more of a kind of a closed caption or the relay challenges there that can come up, or sign language or things like that I know folks are looking into.
Could I echo on something Brendan was mentioning? It's not, we had an issue where we even had a board member at one point when we were calling for a vote on something saying, I couldn't hear everything because I have really bad reception here. So I had to poke county council and ask her to let them know that board member should not be voting on that item, because he at that point admitted the fact that he couldn't hear all of what was being heard about the item before he cast his vote, and he publicly stated it for everyone to hear.
All right, yeah, just again, going back to what you were saying earlier in terms of having to pivot and find, kind of troubleshoot on the fly and have a plan B, but that definitely makes sense. Obviously, you don't want folks voting on things that they don't have all of the information for. So public disclosure and all of that, all great. Perfect, okay. And then we've got a related question. I see folks are still very interested in this. So yeah, the digital divide, internet access, I think will continue to be a challenge. It sounds like there's some infrastructure packages that are hopefully going to be able to help address some of those. Yeah, I see a comment here about elderly constituents and their participation too, and that's something we've heard in all veins of public meetings and public participation, and really knowing your community and how they engage and what those demographics are and what those and how to help troubleshoot some of that in terms of having other options for them. Is it either just being a phone call an option, or can they submit written comments in other ways other than having to be on a virtual meeting and things like that? Definitely can be a challenge if your folks are not super tech savvy or not super willing to participate in this type of a meeting. Completely understand, which also goes back to the equity issues for sure. We do have a related question that we're hoping for some thoughts on in terms of what you're hearing from your community. So I think some of that has started to come through in those recent comments just from you folks, but a lot of that was also focused on your internal challenges. So we're just curious if there's anything from your community that you've heard regarding virtual engagement, and particularly 361 meetings. The link doesn't always work. I, in fact, got a couple of emails about the link to this meeting not working as we were going through that, so definitely a challenge. Not a lot of feedback, generally positive. Folks like the flexibility.
Yeah, I know our large jurisdiction clients are the ones who are most likely to try and stick with this as long as possible. They've really seen those benefits.
Yeah, I'm also noticing that the political considerations are really important. Like our Southern California clients they don't want to do virtual, they want to be in person, and the public wants that. But then if you go to our Northern California clients, it's the opposite.
I think a lot of the folks on the line here have generally positive, some mixed. It sounds like mainly from a technology standpoint, that the link doesn't always work. Sometimes the internet's spotty, sometimes the video freezes, things like that. But then it seems like a lot of folks are also seeing positive feedback from their community and folks that wanted to stay. A little bit of both here, for sure.
Yeah,
Donna, anything that you've heard from your county? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to hop in and say that, we mentioned, taking the conservative approach in terms of having everybody in the board all together and no public allowed. I just want to make a distinction. There's nothing stopping you from having the meeting streamed on Zoom, even if everybody's there and it's a full in-person meeting. That's just something that you can do above and beyond. And there's no reason not to continue if you're seeing those positive results with participation over Zoom or WebEx or whatever. Start your meetings back regularly, but keep that broadcast going if you have the manpower.
Perfect. Just wanted to give Donna an opportunity to share anything she's heard from her community on virtual meetings or anything like that. It sounded like some of your folks were eager to get back in person, but anything else you?
We do have people that are eager to come back in person. We also have people that would prefer to continue with being able to participate virtually because it's much easier for them to take a break from whatever they're doing in their lives to come in and comment on an item they feel passionate about and do that, at home or at their work or something like that. We tomorrow are on top of all of dealing and navigating all of this, again, being as flexible as possible. Our incoming chair wants to be sworn in at his local high school So we are setting up a meeting at the local high school and having to pivot to have students come in, having it be as safe as possible, wearing masks and so forth, and then switching from our normal platform again to a different type of a platform to allow for public participation as well as people coming on campus if they want to. So it's always something different and new.
That seems to be the name of the game, right? And you never thought you were going to be doing event planning in your role as a clerk, I'm sure. So which seems like a little bit of what we've got going on now.
Or digital video production.
Exactly, right? All of the other duties that's assigned are coming to light now. So just really want to thank our attendees for sharing their experience with us, and want to get back into just some of our panel questions and Q&A here. So as I mentioned, I can definitely share those results with folks on the line if there's interest as we share the recording and those types of things. So perfect. I'm hoping that our speakers can share a little bit about what you guys think this means moving forward in terms of meetings outside of a state of emergency. Do you see some of these lessons learned being translated into future meetings in a virtual space? Or what do you guys see that looking like? I know there's a lot of interest in finding that hybrid option or maintaining the virtual option for folks. So can you guys speak a little bit to what you might see moving forward?
Yeah, I could talk about this for a minute. So actually, AB 361 had a companion bill. It was, I think it was called AB 339. It ended up not getting passed, but and there was actually a third bill too that was introduced that never even made it to the governor's desk. But all of these were different approaches to teleconferencing and these virtual agency meetings. We ended up with AB 361. I know that when that was passed, it didn't go as far as a lot of us wanted it to. We didn't want to see that proclaimed state of emergency language in there, and we wanted to be more widely applicable. I saw somebody asked a question if anything like that will be on the horizon. We are not aware of that right now, but as more feedback comes in, because this AB 361 doesn't sunset for another 2 years, and you could bet the legislature is going to take another look at it and see how it performed and whether it met the expectations that they wanted it to, and whether they could, find a path forward for allowing broader virtual meetings. We will be keeping an eye out on that for sure, and we are hopeful that the legislature addresses this once AB 361 is repealed.
And to everybody out there who was hoping for 60 days instead of 30 days, we were right there with you. So I wish we had better news on that front as well.
And for the future, we just hope that and we do believe there will be some new legislation going forward, we just hope that it's permissive so that counties and jurisdictions that can do it, hopefully will do it, but not handicap the ones that absolutely cannot do this because of remote areas, inability to have a complete meeting go forward without any technology issues with spotty reception and things like that. So we just hope that it's permissive.
Yeah, I've heard capacity challenges as well. I mean, you were speaking to that a little bit earlier when you were saying we went from 1 clerk to 2 to 3 to try to staff these. And so I definitely know that the staffing and capacity can be a barrier as well to some of these options. We've got some questions. We've got a lot of questions in from the audience, so I want to start digging through some of those. We do have some questions as it relates to public comment. Folks are hoping for some insight in terms of the benefits versus the risks of having, the chat or comment function open during public meetings, for example, if you're using Zoom and allow that. So what does that look like? And then Donna, particularly as it relates to some of your comments, any thoughts on how to enforce civility during public comments? This is a question I have heard a lot from a lot of different local government folks, and how do you really monitor and facilitate those comments? And so you mentioned that you all as a county decided to remove expletives from comments, but any tips on how you went about that, or how you try to maintain some decorum in that part of the process.
At the time we were reading those comments, so we just made a decision in speaking with our county counsel's office to make sure that we were not violating the Brown Act by saying the word, but then using something that would denote that it was an expletive. So bleep was the generally accepted one that we went with going forward with that. Civility is very much an issue. We still struggle with that on occasion, but we struggled with that before. If somebody was really impassioned about something, they would come to a meeting and there would be groups of them and they would be rather emotional about an issue. So it's been heightened during the pandemic. I think sometimes that people have sort of lost the ability to be as civil as they used to be. But we have worked really hard, as I mentioned before, to talk to these folks that are leading these efforts, and so to make sure that they understand that we need to have a meeting space that's safe for everyone. We've had people heckle other people that had a difference of opinion on whether or not to be vaccinated or not vaccinated. You get a lot of people that are not coming to meetings who would wish a virtual way to come to interact with the board because they don't feel safe walking into our space. Because we have so many people that are currently at our meetings that are anti-vaccination. We've had to talk to our people about, and our board members about, when to answer public comment and when to not answer public comment, because a lot of times they do feel an urge to engage. And we've asked them several times not to do that. If they need somebody to, staff member to follow up with someone, we can help facilitate that, but please do not engage too much with public comment, because it is public comment and it has led to meetings being much longer than they normally are with that type of activity happening. But really talking to people, we have had people get up at the podium and, you know, an expletive comes out and so forth, and then the chair will usually ask them to not do that in the future and that type of a thing. And then we always have deputies there at the meeting. I think that helps most people stay in line, but certainly not all.
Those are good points. And just to this question, we at ILG have come across a lot of cities, counties, and districts that are adopting. There's a lot of words for them, whether they're a civility code or a code of decorum or a code of conduct. So I know a lot of jurisdictions are exploring that. And I just recently wrote an article for Western City Magazine that talks through some of that and has a number of examples from local jurisdictions. So if folks are interested, I'm happy to share links to some of those types of policies that are one way. I know some of our local government colleagues are trying to work through this, but it's a very broad issue and we could spend the whole webinar talking about that issue in particular. So appreciate the question and happy to share those samples that we have. Julian or Brendan, any comments on kind of the benefits versus the risks of having an open chat function on virtual meetings, or anything you've heard from clients?
I haven't heard anything from clients, but I know like the benefit would be increased public participation, but I'm not sure if that benefit outweighs the hostility you may receive from some of the public comments. It really just depends on, I think it depends on your audience and who normally comes to your public meetings, your jurisdiction, and the political atmosphere.
Definitely. A couple of questions about the teleconferencing and locations folks can join from. So are there limitations to where a board or council member could join a teleconferencing meeting from? And related to that, are they required to keep their cameras on? Do you guys know of any requirement there?
I can take this. Julian, correct me if I'm wrong, one of the fundamental changes of AB 361 is that location requirement. So if you're under the emergency procedures, there's not the location requirement. And there's also no video requirement. So no, there's not a requirement that they keep their cameras on. But they do need to have that telephone connection, and it needs to be a two-way telephone connection between the members of the public and the representative.
Perfect. going back to some of the tech issues, and this is also kind of related to the conversation we just had about civility and kind of public comment. For the tech issues or disruption piece that we talked about a little bit earlier, does that also include any, disruptions made by the public? Is that any kind of guidance or thoughts on that in terms of how to regulate disruptions that could come in from a public comment or from the community during a public meeting in a virtual space?
So
Yeah,
in terms of, go ahead.
No, you do.
So in terms of the disruption, for the purposes of whether you can continue to take official action, the disruption, it needs to be a disruption in the broadcast. So again, if the public is not able to see or know what's going on as a result of whatever is happening in, the comments section, or hacking, or the winds blowing down the power lines outside, any of it, if it's prohibiting people from knowing what's going on, that's when you need to stop the official business. In terms of like civility, disrupting the continuity of the meeting or the flow, how you normally run a meeting, that's not going to trigger the AB 361 requirements.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. Have you guys heard of anything or any guidance on going back to public comment a little bit? Will there be opportunities to allow the community to comment virtually or electronically once meetings go back to in person? So I think this is also related to the little bit of the conversation we had earlier about the board being in person but having comments come in virtually. Do you all see any opportunity for folks to still be able to allow for electronic comments if the meeting's happening in person?
I think that's the best outcome, but I'm not sure if that outcome is possible right now. Just because if all of the board is meeting in person, then it's an in-person meeting, and the Brown Act really doesn't account for receiving virtual comments for that. I think there would need to have to be a change, and I think that is hopefully the direction that we're heading to, because it just makes sense in this environment that we're living in. Go ask your lobbyists.
Yeah, at this point, it would, at a minimum, have to be a heavy lift from you all as staff above and beyond what's required. You'd have to be running a normal meeting and a virtual meeting at the same time, I think.
It is very difficult to do. And we also always, any member of the public is able to send us anything that we'll forward to a board member. Or they each, on their website, they have their email addresses out on the website. So there is a way for the public to engage with them outside of a meeting as well.
Yeah, and this broadcasting for convenience, it's been a hit with our clients. The public seems to enjoy it, just to be able to listen to the meeting, even if they can't participate actively, just to be able to hear the meeting and virtually. I think that's been a big success for some of our clients.
Perfect. Appreciate those thoughts. Just looking at the time, so we are getting pretty close to the end of our webinar. So I just have a couple of closing things for everybody on the line. I do also see some comments and questions about social media. That also would be an entire topic in and of itself, and actually one we're looking to dig into this year. So stay tuned for that, and this would be a good way to do that. Sign up for a newsletter, follow us on social media. And you can stay tuned for additional webinars and resources that we're putting out. And then just want to get everybody's contact information up on the screen here. I know there was a lot of questions that we weren't able to get to today, so please don't hesitate to follow up with us if you have additional questions. And then we will also be, as I mentioned at the top, sending out the slide deck and the webinar recording and some sample policies and things like that for you all to take a look at. And just to close this out, I'm hoping that each of my panelists can share one quick thought in terms of like one piece of advice or one thing that you wish you knew kind of going into this process, or something you would share with your colleagues about virtual meetings. Dawn, I don't want to put you on the spot too much, but any thoughts, any advice you would share with your colleagues on the line?
Just be flexible, be ready to pivot, and learn about different technologies and platforms before they are presented to you with a short time frame.
Do your homework and be flexible. Love it. Julian, anything from your perspective?
I would just, I saw some comments earlier about like some people didn't want to follow AB 361 because they didn't like some of the requirements. So I would really just look to see if those requirements are prohibitive of your agency. Like I give an example of a meeting that it was such an important meeting that if something disrupted the broadcast and they had to stop action, they didn't want to follow that because it was such an important meeting they needed to get to. So they decided to meet in person for that. And they have been meeting in person. So just see if these meetings are the right fit for your agency.
Perfect. And Brendan, anything to close us out?
Use that mute button. Comments have to be on topic about your agency's jurisdiction. So if people are spouting off random things online, you use that mute the same way you'd use it in person.
Perfect. So I want to please join me in thanking all of our panelists this afternoon. Really appreciate you taking the time to share your experiences and expertise with us. And then want to thank all of the folks that joined us on the line and sharing their afternoon with us. Really appreciate you joining us as well. So with that, I hope that everybody has a great afternoon and definitely stay in touch with us. Thank you so much.